Today on Steve's Garage, I'll be installing subframe spacers that are actually meant for early P2 Volvos on my lifted P80 V70XC. In a previous video, I installed B&E adjustable strut mounts to try and help correct the positive camber I was experiencing after lifting my car. While they did help, seeing all the lifted P2 cars running subframe spacers to help correct the axle angles made me curious if I could do the same. Things looked pretty similar in photos, but I've never worked on a P2, so I wasn't positive. Then I stumbled across someone who was installing a P2 subframe on a P80, and confirming with him was all the assurance I needed to pick up some subframe spacers from Cross Country Performance. So this video could be helpful if you drive a P2, but I can't confirm what things look like or exact specs when it comes to tightening the bolts. To start things off, I took an angle measurement of the front passenger side CV axle with the car on the ground. I know it's a little hard to see, but it says 11 degrees. I don't know what the angle is at stock height, so while this may seem meaningless, I did want to get a before and after measurement to see the difference. Generally, CVs and control arms should be pretty much flat when the car is static, so even without the angle measurement, you can tell the geometry isn't right on this front suspension. You will need the car off the ground for this job, and I found it easiest to put it up on ramps. That way you can use your jack and jack stands to support the subframe as you're removing and installing the bolts. Before we get started, I'm going to cover exactly what I'm installing and the tools I use to do it. First of all, I would highly recommend an impact gun. A breaker bar will do, but this will make your life a lot easier. 14, 17, 18, and 22 mil sockets. You'll need a torque wrench. I've got an electric one today that has an angle setting since that is needed for the subframe bolts, but you can just eyeball it. And lastly, a pry bar isn't a bad idea. Cross Country Performance supplies you with everything you need, unless you're doing it on a P80 like I am today. But this kit is sold for a P2, so it's not a knock on them, it's just me being thorough about my installation on a car that isn't technically supported. As for P80 fitment, you'll find that the Cross Country Performance bolts are too short. You can see that the larger subframe bolt from the kit is the same length as the stock bolt, so once you add the spacer in there, you won't even catch any threads. I purchased a 140mm long bolt to compensate for the spacer and to get the proper thread engagement. The smaller rear plate bolts that go into the body are also too short, so I purchased some 60mm long bolts, and those did the trick. Before starting under the car, I would disconnect your upper engine mount. While this isn't required, when you drop the subframe you'll be putting a lot of stress on this mount, and once you're done with the spacers, this will be sitting at a different angle. Just a side note about the fitment of things, the catch can that I previously installed no longer contacts the charge pipe after I put the spacers on, and while that was a little bonus, I also couldn't get the stock airbox to fit anymore, which is why I had to use a cone filter on the end of the intake pipe. With the car up in the air, you should be able to see the large 18mm front bolts at each corner. Then the rear has one 18mm through the subframe and two smaller 14mm that go through the plate and into the body. I didn't start out supporting the subframe, as you can see by the amount of drop that happens when I loosen the bolt, but I would if I were you. Support it with a jack so you're not putting any stress on the bolts or the threads within the car. I started with the front right but was greeted with some water dripping out, so I moved to the rear, removed those bolts, and then went back up to the front bolt when it was done draining. Once those bolts were removed, I supported the passenger side with the stands so I could move my jack over to the driver's side. Moving over to the driver's side, it looks identical to the passenger side, but just loosen these bolts, don't remove them all the way. You'll end up doing that eventually, but for now, it doesn't hurt having the subframe and everything that's attached to that still attached to the car. At this point, I had to do a little shuffle with the jack and the stands. I wanted the jack on the passenger side so I could raise and lower that as needed, while the driver's side remained static with the stands. I'm not going to tell you this is the only way to do things, but 4 stands and a jack made this whole process pretty easy for me. Now we're ready to install the spacers. I started with the front passenger, and that only required a minimal drop of the subframe from where I had it positioned. Moving on to the rear, you can see I had to drop it down pretty far to get it above the subframe, but still really no trouble. At this point, you could loosely install the bolts through the subframe just to hold it in place, but I did end up loosening or removing them entirely later on. It's really up to you, but I wanted to try and keep this thing connected to the car, if for no other reason than general safety and trying to keep stress off other components. Now we can swing over to the driver's side, which is not as simple as the passenger side. I shuffled the jack and stands around again because I wanted adjustability on the driver's side. If you left the bolts in over here, finish removing them and let the jack down so you have some space between the subframe and the body. And that's when you'll see the issue. The driver's side front and rear mounting locations have these little locator pins coming off the body. I'm not sure if these are present on the P2, so maybe it's only a P80 problem, but it did make things a little more difficult. The front spacer actually went in pretty easily, just drop the subframe low enough that you can get around it and you'll be able to squeeze it in there. The rear was problematic, and where disconnecting the upper mount and having a pry bar really came in handy. As for the rear, if you have a better solution than this, I'm all ears, or someone else is all ears, because I'm not doing this again. I had the rear bolts and the front driver's side removed. The front passenger was just barely threaded in. I used my jack to jack the front of the subframe up, effectively angling the whole thing backwards, and then I took my pry bar to pry between the body and the subframe, and only then was I able to barely get that spacer in. My apologies for not filming that whole process. There just wasn't enough room for everything under the car that was going on. At this point, all the subframe spacers should be installed, and we'll get to the smaller support plate spacers in a minute. Before you do those, you want to start drawing the subframe back up to the body. After all the shuffling and prying, my subframe was actually out of alignment, so I couldn't get all 4 bolts threaded in. My solution for that was to jack the car up off the ramps, move the stands back under the rocker area, and let the pressure off the subframe. I did have 2 or 3 bolts connected, so it's not like I was putting all the weight on the drivetrain or suspension, but doing that allowed the subframe to have enough wiggle room to thread the other bolts in. Once I was able to get all 4 bolts engaged, the car went back down on the ramps, as that's the most secure way to do all this work. With all 4 bolts started, I snugged up the front subframe bolts and then moved on to the rear. You can secure the subframe bolt through that mounting plate, slot in your spacers, and then snug that whole rear end up. Now we can move to torquing it all down. I started with the front subframe bolts, and I put the jack under the subframe to take some pressure off of it. These get tightened to 105 Newton meters, or about 77 foot-pounds, and then another 120 degrees. Do that for both fronts, and then we can move on to the rear. The rear subframe bolt, the 18mm one, that is the same as the front, 105 Newton meters, or 77 foot-pounds, and then 120 degree angle tighten. The smaller 14mm bolts are 50 Newton meters, or 37 foot-pounds, and no angle tighten. If you're watching this video and working on a P2, I would double check all those torque specs, as I cannot confirm that they're the same. Once everything was tightened down, you can visually tell the difference immediately. I'm still up on the ramps, and sticking the angle gauge on the CV axle shows 8.6, which is definitely an improvement. After getting the car off the ramps and taking it for a drive, you can see the control arms are nearly flat, and the angle of the CV axle is much better than it was. I can also confirm that I had way less axle problems after doing this, so it was well worth the time and effort. If you enjoyed this video, you should think about subscribing, and definitely let me know if it helped you out on a P2 car. Don't hesitate to leave any questions down below. I'll try to help you out as best I can. If you are interested in more P80 videos, I've got an entire playlist you can check out, and I've still got more to edit and post. Thanks so much for watching, everybody.